I'm here with Dennis Wise, Dr. Dennis Wise from the University of Arizona. He's a lecturer in the writing program there, and has also published extensively in science fiction, fantasy, and 20th and 21st century British and American literature. And so, Dennis, you've written quite a few articles sort of looking at Tolkien and Tolkien studies and various elements of Tolkien's work. So I suppose let's just begin by talking briefly about your experience with Tolkien. So, when did you first get into Tolkien? Was it sort of as a child with sort of the Hobbit, the getting read a Hobbit as a child kind of story that a lot of people have, or did you come to Tolkien later? Or
I actually did come to him late. I read the Hobbit a couple times in grade school and high school. I liked the Hobbit, but I think I tried and failed to read Lord of the Rings twice in high school. I never got past Bombadil. I actually forced myself to read the whole thing when I was like 22, and I didn't like it much. But then I read it again when I was 30, and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. Well, it's odd because I always liked fantasy literature. That's all I read. It's just that I somehow never got into Tolkien until really late.
Yeah, that's really interesting because usually people will have this sort of childhood. There seems to be something about childhood and Tolkien and the Hobbit and but that's a really interesting story there. What sort of struck you as interesting about the Lord of the Rings when you were 30 that perhaps you hadn't seen when you were 22? I suppose getting past Bombadil, maybe that was part of it, I suppose.
Well, that did help. That did help. No, it's just when I was older, this is when I was in the middle of my graduate work, and I'd actually taken classes in medieval literature, and I was actually seeing what he was doing. So, as strong of an emotional response as people tend to have to Tolkien, I was really interested by the intellectual things that he was doing. And the more I studied him, the more interesting that he got. So I always knew when I went to grad work, I wanted to work in fantasy because that's my favorite genre. But I then focused on Tolkien because he's obviously the grandfather and things. And, the more medievalism I learned about, the more interesting things I saw that he was actually doing in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that interest in some of Tolkien's, as you say, intellectual side, as it were, comes through in your papers. Just out of interest, what were some of the other fantasy writers or authors that you were interested in sort of earlier on?
Well, my all-time favorite was Stephen Donaldson. I read the Chronicles of Trump's Covenant when I was really young. Didn't like them the first time I read those either, but I read them again in high school, and they just kind of blew me away. I also really a big fan of Glenn Cook, he's not the most famous of the fantasy writers of the 80s and 90s, but he's somebody who really does it for me. So Donaldson, Glenn Cook, Ursula Le Guin, these are, for me, some of the classics.
Le Guin is, a favorite of mine as well. Did you read Martin? I know my co-host for this podcast, we sort of talk a little bit about Martin because he was reading them in the 90s, before the show. So did you ever get into that, or was that sort of a, not something of interest to you?
Yeah. Actually, you're going to detect a theme here. I read them again in grad school with R.R. Martin for the first time. Because there was about 10 or 15 years where I stopped reading fantasy. I slowly got back into it. And I read the first two books for The Song of Ice and Fire. I did not like them. And I only read them just because I was bored with my actual graduate work. Then I read a plot summary of book 3 in The Song of Ice and Fire, and I read about the Red Wedding, and that was the first time that a plot summary actually made me drop my jaw when I got to the Red Wedding part. So I started rereading it, book 3, and then I realized that I was just really reading his books really, really badly. I had kind of like a chip on my shoulder about how good fantasy was, and that his fantasy wasn't very good. And, I realized I had a very wrong opinion about it. And so that made me pay attention to things like what sort of expectations do we bring to texts when we read them. Yeah. And that kind of paves way for some of the research I've done for why people generally despise fantasy. Because I was kind of one of those people because I had stopped reading fantasy for about 10 or 15 years.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think I'm still perhaps in that place with Martin. I mean, I have read through the books up to where they are, currently, which is, I think the last one was 2011, so it's been quite a while. Yeah, I'm not really a fan of his written stuff. So I don't know. Maybe I need to get over that bias as well. But anyway, we'll see how we go if the next book
He can be.
is ever
He's very
released.
grim, which is
Yes,
tough for some people. Some people just
Sure.
dislike the grimness.
Sure. All right, so going back to Tolkien, of course, which is the main sort of topic for today and for this podcast, of course. So we're going to look at sort of just a couple of your papers, which, I thought were really interesting. And as I said, you've written quite a few of them. So, I'd recommend listeners, look Dennis up on Google or whatever, and you can find a few links to papers, and I'll ask you later, of course, where people might be able to find some more of them. But today I just wanted to look at a couple. And the first one I wanted to sort of have a think about was published earlier this year in the Journal of Tolkien Research. And for those interested, this is a free journal. You don't have to go through an academic library or anything. All the papers are available for anyone to find online on the website. So again, I'd highly recommend going and having a look if you're interested in doing so. This is a fairly new journal. I think it's been around for 2 or 3 years, but it started publishing some really interesting stuff and some really quality stuff. So it's a great new location for academic Tolkien studies. So this paper is called "On Ways of Studying Tolkien: Notes Towards a Better Epic Fantasy Criticism," with epic in parentheses. There are so many fascinating pieces for this article. I mean, in the first case, it's just a great summary of the state of the art, as it were, and also the history of Tolkien studies in a general sense. Also, the place of what's been called capital T theory. That was a really useful part of the article. And then you also go on to sort of suggest a new way or a new approach to studying fantasy, and I suppose Tolkien, which looks at Strauss, Leo Strauss, and Straussianism. And I'm going to ask you about that later, because being an Australian, I feel like Straussianism is this very American thing. I'm not quite sure what it is or what it refers to. I know it's got something to do with sort of the secret meaning of text or something like that, but I'm going to ask you about that.
One aspect to them, yeah.
So
it's actually American, French, and Chinese is where he's actually the biggest. United States, France, and China at the moment.
Right, okay. That's fascinating, yeah. I feel like here he hasn't made too much of an impact anywhere in our sort of philosophy departments or literary departments, but certainly it seems to me in America he's very big. So I will ask you about that, and that's really a big part of this piece. You argue this might be an interesting way to approach Tolkien. So we'll get into sort of why that might be. But first of all, I want to sort of talk a little bit about some of those other aspects. So I guess just to start, so as I said, it's really a great précis on the history and current state of Tolkien studies. So where do you think, I guess, we are in the field in a general sense? So, Tolkien's been talked about by scholars, really since The Lord of the Rings, since The Hobbit was published, I suppose, in a sense. And, nowadays, certainly following the Peter Jackson, the 2 trilogies, Peter Jackson, perhaps there was more interest, and books continue to be published and articles are written. So, where do you think we are in the field in a general sense, I suppose?
Well, it's good news. The field is booming right now, honestly. And Tolkien is easily the most studied author in science fiction and fantasy. And it's not even close. In terms of the books and articles and journals on a single author, nobody even really compares to Tolkien in science fiction and fantasy. And probably a lot of mainstream writers, realist writers as well, don't really compare to how much he gets studied. At the same time, for the field of Tolkien studies itself, I do see it as being very Tolkien-centered, which might seem odd considering it's called Tolkien studies. But what I mean by that is tends to be concerned first and foremost with Tolkien himself, his biography, his works, his immediate historical context, that sort of thing. And that's a little bit in contrast to the field of science fiction and fantasy studies, which tends to see Tolkien as relatively conservative, he's class conscious, he's anti-modern, he's uncomfortably regressive, and so on. And so they might give a lot of lip service to the importance of Tolkien. He doesn't really figure into any of their critical paradigms at all. So he's kind of like marginalized in that sense within SFF studies, as opposed to Tolkien studies where he's very, very central.
For sure. Yeah, and I'll sort of ask you a bit about that as well, because I think that was an interesting part of your paper. I wasn't aware of sort of the apprehension that SF scholars have or had at least towards Tolkien. I suppose we can go there now. I suppose. Why do you think that is? And perhaps you gestured towards that. There's sort of a political incompatibility, perhaps, but what's motivating that? Intense dislikes, occasionally. Do you think?
So I think one of the big reasons that I think the loudest science fiction critics, partly it has to do with the way the genre is developed, or the way science fiction and fantasy have developed themselves over the 20th century. Now, especially in the Anglo-American world, in the 20th century, science fiction has had a much bigger head start than fantasy did. Most of the pulp journals were SF. There's a few fantasy ones, but nothing really big. And as a concept, and nothing really big until the Tolkien boom in the late 60s, that is. And so essentially, in terms of pulp fiction, it was science fiction who took the lead, as opposed to fantasy. And that kind of meant that academic science fiction criticism developed a whole lot sooner than academic fantasy criticism did. And so SF criticism in academia started in the 1970s. And what that meant is that a lot of fantasy critics, few in the late 70s, mostly in the 80s, they were not concerned with Tolkien primarily, but they often tended to borrow a lot of theoretical assumptions and presuppositions from academic science fiction criticism, particularly the journal Science Fiction Studies. And by and large, these assumptions were Marxist, historical, and materialist in nature. And what was especially big in the 1970s is that these Marxist science fiction critics of the 70s, people like Darko Suvin and Frederick Jameson, they really had it in for fantasy literature. They wrote about as if they had a grudge against it. And I think it was mostly because they were trying to elevate science fiction as a literary genre. And one of the strategies they used to do that was to contrast it with fantasy, which they considered, regressive and reactionary and so forth. So in one sense, I think they were trying to elevate the prestige of science fiction by contrasting it with fantasy. And so they could sort of turn this to mainstream academics who tend to privilege postmodernism and realism, say, hey, science fiction can't be all that bad. It's much more theoretically advanced than fantasy is. And by the 1980s, fantasy largely meant Tolkien, so that is where a lot of science fiction animosity to fantasy tended to come, in my view.
Yeah, I think that's really convincing and interesting. And you give one sort of quote in your paper, which I can't remember exactly the critic you're talking about there, but he contrasts, or Tolkien is perhaps contrasted with Samuel Delany, who's famous SF writer.
Oh yeah, that's Carl Freeman.
Other things. Carl Freeman, right? Yes, yeah. And he sort of makes the comment that Delany is a cognitive writer and Tolkien is supposedly non-cognitive. And I'm not quite sure what this means. And I'm sort of reading through Delany at the moment, in part because I haven't done so before, and sort of there was a few days that went by a couple of weeks ago when I sort of read there were several different people who made reference to him. So I sort of thought, oh gosh, I should actually look into this. And I'm sort of reading through Dahlgren at the moment. Have you read that? Have you read that one?
No, it's the one I know I should read, but I have not gone through Dahlgren. I went through Triton though.
Yeah, it's very strange, but it's interesting. I'm I don't know if enjoying it is the right word, but I'm getting there.
I have a complicated experience with Delany as well. So unlike Le Guin, who I really love, Delany has just never been one of my favorites, and so I do have a really tough time sympathizing with his work. But he does tend to be really put on a pedestal by a lot of SFF critics, especially like people like Carl Freeman. So Freeman is actually in the same tradition as Darko Suvin and Frederick Jameson. So he's very much with their Marxist critical assumptions. And one of the reasons he likes Delaney is because even though Delaney does write fantasy, he writes it in a good way for free, which apparently makes a big difference.
Yeah. I suppose I was interested, in this notion of cognitive and what this means. Does this sort of seem to imply political agreement, sort of that there's a fusion between the politics of the critic and the writer, or is there something more that's going on there? Do you think, what is non-cognitive about Tolkien in the eyes of these critics? Is it just his politics, for example, or is it something else?
Well, for people like Suvin and Freeman and Jameson, when you're writing cognitive work, which they consider this as science fiction to be, they're saying that science fiction allegedly works as a form of extrapolation from present conditions, with the intent of criticizing these present conditions. That's considered cognitive. It might not actually be possible. So, for example, faster than light travel is not possible, and lightsabers aren't possible. But it's at least theoretically possible. It has a scientific veneer to it. It's at least purporting to be possible if a certain set of science has been discovered. So this idea that the future is something that is extrapolated from the present and that it is compatible with modern science, or what a future science might look like, is what cognition means in that case. Fantasy, in contrast, is for these critics, they look at fantasy and they say, okay, fantasy is ignoring science because they just want to have books about magic spells and fairies, to put that in a little bit combative way. So that's considered irrational and non-cognitive. They're ignoring science, they're ignoring what we know epistemologically about the modern world, and saying, let's have magic spells and fairies. But to me, this distinction has never really made a whole lot of sense. Because besides Delaney and Le Guin, there's lots of writers in the pulps in the 20th century who've written both science fiction and fantasy. So Poe Anderson, Piers Anthony, Stephen Donaldson, they've all written fantasy as good as their SF. But in theoretical terms, for Delaney in particular, what he does is he is one of the really few pulp writers out of the New Age New Age SF, a New Wave SF. He's one of the few writers. He's explicitly Marxist in his writing. He's explicitly deconstructionist, which in the 70s was very cutting edge. And also his status as one of the New Wave's first openly queer and African-American writers, that gave him a lot of street cred. So in addition to being really theoretically advanced, he just had a lot of things. He was talking about a lot of things that people cared about. So that's why even though Delaney's turned to fantasy and sword and sorcery, in the 80s or so, that gave his fantasy a cognitive veneer that these Marxist critics were saying that a lot of Tolkien-based fantasy did not have.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I have read a couple of Delaney's sort of more pure, I guess, SF novels like Babel 17 and Nova. And I was rereading Babel 17 recently, and I just sort of felt very dated to me, perhaps ironically, given its, as you say, sort of cutting edge status, on publication, where I guess, I'm obviously biased, but I reread Tolkien and it feels, to use that cliche, kind of timeless. And look, that's perhaps, stating things a little strongly. I still enjoy his science fiction, Delaney's science fiction novels, but it did feel sort of its time in a way that Tolkien, still, I guess he still feels of his time, but for me at least, has more resonance.
Yeah, and one other thing that's weird about this whole binary between cognitive and non-cognitive is that even though we have a lot of writers who do science fiction and fantasy, that whole binary doesn't even really apply to Tolkien. Because in one sense, Middle-earth is a secondary world with no clear connection to the present world and seems to have magical elements to it. That's for certain. But Tolkien was a philologist. And if you ever looked at his academic writings, philology is an intensely intellectual and rigorous field to study. And one of the reasons, and he applies that philological knowledge to The Lord of the Rings, especially in the creation of Arda and his secondary world. And
Definitely.
one of the reasons he got stuck, and so he never published a Silmarillion or his Legendarium within his lifetime. And one of the reasons was he kind of got stuck with it. He couldn't really reconcile the mythical worldview being purported in some of the Silmarillion stories with the scientific worldview that he knew to be true. So, for example, his elves were allegedly, so this is later in his career, he thought that elves would be so enlightened that they would never believe in a flat world cosmology. They would always know for the fact that the world was round. Except the problem with that idea was that some of his early stories were very dependent on a flat world cosmology. And so Tolkien really couldn't reconcile the sort of this mythological thinking with the scientific thinking. And that kind of just bogged him down with the Legendarium. He ended up never finishing it before he died, which is why Christopher Tolkien's had to do so much posthumous work. But Tolkien was a very intensely intellectual writer within his field of philology. And so it always seems kind of strange to call his work non-cognitive simply because it doesn't accept a modern scientific viewpoint. There's a lot of other cognitive elements to it, but I don't think SF critics ever just wanted to see those aspects to Tolkien.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And certainly reading some of Tolkien's scholarship, for example, in the recent Beowulf publication, or comparatively recent, I think it came out in 2014, some of the criticism and sort of historical philology that was included in that publication really shows just how rigorous Tolkien, could be as a philologist. But just to return briefly to Tolkien studies, as a field, you mentioned before that the field really has a focus on Tolkien the man, and I've always found that we've perhaps gently criticized SF critics a little bit, but I want to come around to criticizing Tolkien scholars a little bit here, because I've always found this myself, just speaking for myself, a little bit disconcerting, because it seemed to me that, for example, the publication of Tolkien's letters and other statements that he has made, in various places, sort of function as kind of holy writ. His interpretations certainly privileged, continue to be, and it's often seemed to me that other kind of ways of reading Tolkien, and recently I've noticed, at least anecdotally online, there's this very interesting surge of sort of queer readings of Tolkien, which may appeal to some people and may not appeal to others, and that's fine. But my feeling is that whenever I see a post, for example, on Twitter, or just always a great place to go to gauge these things, I suppose. But sort of giving a reading like that, people will invariably respond. Tolkien was a Catholic. You can't think that. He said his work was fundamentally Catholic, and he never intended Sam and Frodo to be queer at all. And you will see these kinds of responses, and I just think, well, first of all, I think people should be allowed to sort of have those readings if they want, and I find some merit there.
I agree. Yeah, me too.
Even myself, I think they're interesting readings and new readings, and whilst no one would deny that Tolkien, certainly at the end of his life, when most of the letters sort of published in the letters volume were written, no one would deny that he was quite a devout Catholic. Although I think some writers like John Garth would want to provide some nuance there, especially sort of in his early life. I still think that Tolkien studies, has a tendency to center, as you say, center the man and his opinions a little too forcefully. And just a small anecdote, the last sort of podcast, for those who've been listening, I was talking with my co-host in the mainstream of the podcasts. We were talking about Eldarion and Arendis, this story that Tolkien sort of seems to have written in the 60s. We briefly went on to talk about Tolkien as a Catholic writer, and my co-host sort of just nonchalantly said, I know Tolkien said that The Lord of the Rings was a fundamentally Catholic work, but maybe that's what he wanted to believe. And I just thought, my co-host is he likes fantasy, but he's not a heavy Tolkien reader, so he's a bit of a lighter fan than me, I guess. Okay. But it was nice to just hear a fresh view like that. Like, maybe we shouldn't just take this at face value.
Yeah. So I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, he was obviously. I think he was obviously very sincere in his faith, but he also really liked Northern heroic literature, which was predominantly pagan. And so one of the more interesting questions is, how do you reconcile a pagan worldview with a Christian worldview? And the answer is not easily, but I mean, he's come up with a couple of different things. And so, definitely, if you just take any one statement from his letters and cherry pick it and see it as completely at face value, like this is a fundamentally Catholic work, it's very easy to complicate that because there's a lot of other aspects to him as well.
That's right, yeah. And my feeling, I suppose, it's a long-winded way for me to get to a question, but my feeling is that for a lot of Tolkien scholars, had they heard my friend and co-host, had they heard that remark, they would have sort of recoiled from it and said, well, no, that's not true. We have to take Tolkien very seriously. So I suppose, where do you feel like Tolkien studies can go forward in the biographical sense? Should we perhaps place less emphasis on him as a man and more on sort of, I guess, reader reception, if you like, to use that kind of jargon, and think a bit less about those biographical elements, and perhaps make more room for some of these more, these new readings that are sort of popular these days?
Well, in one sense, I'll mention a story I read about Michael D.C. Drought, who's one of the co-editors of Tolkien Studies. And this is an article he published, I think, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But he mentioned, like, one of the most common reasons people have articles rejected from Tolkien Studies is because they tend to take Tolkien too much at face value. They aren't critical enough in their evaluations. And so this is this awareness that you can't just, take Tolkien's biographical statements as wholly read is common, at least within the most advanced Tolkien studies in the field. So there's an element of criticism there. That seems to be a little bit different from applying what we might call like a theoretical perspective to Tolkien. And for the most part, I don't think Tolkienists like theory, or in particular critical theory, all that much, which is something I think which is both good and bad. It's good in the sense that, if you look at Tolkien criticism hoping to find an explanation of what a particular thing in Tolkien is going on, I think Tolkien studies tends to be really good at that. It's really good at explanation of what's going on either in the text or in a particular reference or a particular literary source or things like that. And that's what it's really, really good at. But the whole point of critical theory, and critical theory is not all the same, there are a lot of very different paradigms, is that theory is really good at asking new questions that were not thought of before about particular texts. And that kind of theoretical perspective is something that Tolkien studies tends not to be very much engaged in. Partly, I think the reason it has to do with just training. A lot of Tolkienists are medievalists, and medievalism is one of those sub-branches of literary studies that has tended to resist theory the strongest, even though in recent years that's kind of been changing. But more importantly, a lot of Tolkienists, tend to go into the field because they are deeply in love with Tolkien's work, and the critical aspects of theory are not really compatible with a writer whom you're deeply in love with. And just as importantly, Tolkien, who is, despite what we've just been saying, he is relatively conservative. He is a Catholic. He's class conscious. He's a monarchist, or at least as close as one you're going to find in the 20th century. And he just isn't the sort of writer that a lot of these contemporary theoretical paradigms were developed to praise. As good as theory is at thinking up new kinds of questions to ask of text, for Tolkien, the answers to the typical questions the theory tends to ask, the answers all tend to be negative. And that same goes for all the many errors Tolkien has in modern epic fantasy. And so that's one of my viewpoints, whereas critical theory is something that's both necessary and good. It doesn't tend to work well with Tolkien, because I think Tolkien was just too different of a writer, and that the assumptions behind theory just don't know what to do with them, basically.
Sure.
So we kind of need...
Yeah, go on, sorry.
Oh, yeah. So we just kind of need new theoretical paradigms in order to approach Tolkien in epic fantasy.
Sure. And we'll come to Straussianism in a moment. But just before that, I know you're sort of also interested in feminist sort of theory. So if we take that as an example, do you think that, for example, approaching Tolkien with a feminist lens I mean, on a sort of a basic level, if you like, you might just look at the Lord of the Rings and say, oh, there's, few women in it, therefore Tolkien is bad. And you can get that sort of negative reading. But, I've read some pretty interesting and nuanced feminist perspectives on Tolkien that don't just sort of churn out sort of a default negative response, that are critical, but also kind of, thought-provoking and interesting. And of course, as I mentioned, we talked about Eldarion and Arendis in the last podcast, and gosh, there's a lot there, that is fascinating from that point of view. The character of Arendis, and Calumet, her daughter, and the whole perspective that they have towards men, and there's a whole interesting discussion to be had about that story from a feminist point of view. But do you think there's room for capital C, capital T critical theory to approach Tolkien in a nuanced, interesting way, or do you think it's just, and for example, thinking about feminist studies, for example, or do you think that, as you say, it's just not really the right approach? And I know in this paper that we've been that I've mentioned, that we've been talking about, you discuss a couple of sort of new approaches. I think Helen Young, for example, on race and a few others. But I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that you bring up feminism in particular is an interesting case with Tolkien. And that there have been attempts to read Tolkien in light of feminism, feminist theory, but they have tended not, in my view, to be very theoretically informed feminist approaches to Tolkien. So they might talk about his female characters, or they might talk about his personal views on women. And that doesn't quite answer the more, maybe the deeper theoretical issues when it comes to feminism. Now, feminism is, like most critical theories, it's one of those theories where you can't just say the word feminism. There's lots of different kinds. And so things like postmodern feminism that's been influenced by Michel Foucault, I think is very antithetical to what Tolkien is about. And that's basically we're saying, gender is entirely a social construct. It's a strong form of social constructivism that denies any agency or power to the idea of nature. And I think that's very much, so in one sense that could be seen as a very progressive and radical view, but it's not something that's really compatible with Tolkien, because he does kind of believe in a type of essentialism. He does believe in a unified, coherent cosmos with God, sort of God at the apex. And he does in some sense believe there's a natural place for people within this cosmos. And that's not an assumption that's going to do very well under like a postmodern feminist lens. Now, one of the things I do think with Tolkien is that he probably, like a postmodern feminist lens or even second wave feminism, isn't very much on his gender. He probably was more familiar with the first wave feminism, where it basically assumed a liberal subject for feminists who are trying to, get the right to vote and things like that. I think he tends to be very much, he never comes out and says it, but my sense of Tolkien is that he was not a fan of social activism per se. The idea that you could overturn the current social order by purely human or secular efforts is kind of what Saruman does. And I think he does the idea of purely secular revolutions as being a recipe for tyranny, in a sense. He would have seen this with the Soviet Revolution in 1919. He would have seen this in very other ways. But in a sense, he has a very conservative Burkean perspective on that. And so this idea of, changing society through social activism by purely secular efforts, I think he would have thought is hubristic. So even in a first wave feminism sense, he's kind of orthogonal to that. Now, he's sympathetic to women as part of his Christian background. But the assumptions that he brings to a text like The Lord of the Rings, I think, just don't really work well under any of the really major feminist paradigms that I know of. So talking about feminism Tolkien is kind of tough in that sense.
Sure. This is something that we did talk about a little last time with regards, again, to Eldarion and Arendis. Do you think that's a sort of a later work, sort of a 60s work? And I asked this of my co-host. Do you think that some of that later work, perhaps Eldarion and Arendis, some of the other post-Lord of the Rings material, do you think there's a sort of sense that there's perhaps a growing awareness that, in the Lord of the Rings, for example, the lack of women characters, comparatively speaking, is a problem, and that perhaps he's thinking about redressing that, for example, in the character of Arendis, and and her perspective, or do you think that takes it a bit too far?
It's possible.
Mm.
I mean, I haven't read that particular text recently. My sense
Sure,
is that it might be easy to read things in Tolkien that we want to read in Tolkien as
sure, yeah,
well. And so, I mean, we
yeah.
kind of want him to be, pro-feminism, whatnot. And
Mm-hmm.
whereas he has this one, in one sense, he has this very universalist perspective. We are all equal under God. Men, women, rich, poor. I mean, that's a very ancient Christian tradition that I think he was very much in favor of. And so he was certainly not, um, regressive in that sense. But in terms of the theoretical ideas that, postmodern feminism or second wave feminism kind of promote, he was very much against those kinds of theories. And so in one
Yeah.
sense, it's hard to say in that sense.
Yeah, yeah, and perhaps that's just a speculation from me. But in any case, yeah. So we've sort of talked about critical theory, but as I mentioned before, and as you've sort of gestured towards in this paper, you also make an argument, make a sort of positive argument for a Straussian reading or approach to Tolkien. So first of all, as I said towards the beginning of the podcast, as an Australian, I'm not familiar with Strauss. So who was he, and what is his philosophy about? And we'll start there anyway.
Okay. Well, I might suggest I'm arguing more closely for maybe a neo-Straussian approach.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of Strauss that I don't quite accept. That idea that there's like secret hidden meanings to texts. It's one of the things I think is a little bit wonky about his writing.
Right. Yeah.
Basically, Leo Strauss is this German-born political philosopher who was extremely skeptical of the historicist schools of thought that was promoted by people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger. And he was mainly interested in understanding classical political philosophy, especially Plato, as a way of resisting the wholesale relativism he saw as endemic to modern thinking. That is, rather than seeing individual subjectivity as something that's wholly determined by history, which, by the way, is something that Marxist theory tends to do, Strauss understood classical political philosophy as taking its orientation from what it understood to be as nature, or the whole. For Strauss, this understanding of nature is very radical and critical because it resists what the many consider true by convention or by opinion or by tradition. In contrast, a lot of modern critical theory tends to understand nature as something that's thoroughly regressive rather than radical. And many forms of contemporary literary criticism proceed under that assumption that nature is wholly bad and not useful at all. It's one of the reasons why they tend to be so dismissive of Tolkien, who does seem to accept something like a natural order of things. But anyway, to make a long story short, what really makes Strauss interesting to me is the clash he sees between ancient and modern political philosophy. And that's something that I think fantasy does really well. Because of Tolkien, a lot of fantasy is medievalist in orientation. The Middle Ages were obviously pre-modern. And so epic fantasy really helps convey a new understanding of this clash between the ancient and the modern that Strauss talked about at great length in his writings.
Okay, so that's fascinating. And I suppose it's long been noted by Tolkien scholars, of course, that Tolkien is kind of, well, he's been called anti-modern, I suppose, anti-industrial, those sorts of phrases are used of him. So how do you think Tolkien in particular reconciles or, engages with that sort of ancient versus modern sort of dichotomy, if you like?
Right. Well, I think there's elements of both in his writings. So yeah, Tolkien does have this reputation as being anti-modern and as backward-looking. But there's actually been a lot of work on the modern aspects of Tolkien. Tom Shippey comes to mind pretty quickly. The idea of an alliance of nations in the War of the Rings coming together for a common purpose, that's modern. You don't get that in the Middle Ages. The way that you do in Lord of the Rings. So that's very modern. The idea that the One Ring can be addictive is kind of modern as well. For my purposes, I tend to understand the ancient and modern conflict between ancient and modern in Tolkien as a conflict between different regimes in his writings. So because we know his sources, we kind of know whether a particular polity is ancient or modern. So for the Shire, it's kind of based on a 19th century rural England that Tolkien remembers from his childhood. So that the Shire is modern. Lake Town is modern. Mordor and Saruman's empire, those are all modern polities. In contrast, you get things like Rohan and Gondor and the elves, who are pre-modern in a sense. And so one of the interesting things about The Lord of the Rings is that you have these hobbits who are modern types of people who leave the protected Shire and go out into the wide pre-modern world of Gondor and Rohan and all these other places. And they are improved by that experience. When the hobbits come back to the Shire, everybody except Bilbo is nobler, braver. They have the wherewithal to withstand Sharkies take over the Shire. Whereas I think Merry and Pippin would not have been able to do that had they not engaged in their adventures in Middle-earth. And so The Lord of the Rings is really this book where you have people from modern times interacting with people from pre-modern times, and both are being improved by those experiences. So in that sense, Tolkien is not anti-modern. He's just saying we need to look at what is non-modern and figure out what we can learn from it. And that's one of the more interesting dynamics, I think, that play at The Lord of the Rings.
What does sort of reading Strauss, I guess, or how does his idea of this sort of modern versus ancient political philosophy, how does that sort of play into what Tolkien is doing, I guess, or how does that clarify what Tolkien is doing?
Strauss himself actually is a very enigmatic writer. It's kind of hard to pinpoint his views on any one particular subject. And so his whole discussion of the ancient and modern is wedged between discussions of different writers in various places in his work. So it's kind of hard to sort of tease out the nuances and pieces of that. But I think the big thing with Strauss is that he liked the idea that classical political philosophy emphasized the idea that man is naturally a part of his polity. The Greek city-state polis for the Greek writers, but man is very much a member of his society naturally, and that is one of the innovations that modern political philosophy has kind of done away with. So if you look at the early modern liberal theorists like Locke and Hobbes, they say that you can extrapolate man out of civil society and into the state of nature. So basically they're saying civil society and nature are not the same. And that's kind of a radical innovation off of classical political philosophy because they didn't think you could make that distinction. And so modern liberalism is based on the idea that you can imagine mankind, the individual, as being outside of his city, outside of his polity. And through a very complicated process that basically leads to the idea of, history as the ultimate ground of any individual subjectivity. If you have no way to understand humankind by nature, by mankind as being within a civil society, then how do you understand mankind? And you have to say that through history is the answer. And Strauss thought that led to a thoroughgoing relativism. So the thing that he likes about classical political philosophy is that it gives philosophers something to think about in terms of if something's not just convention, it's not just true by common opinion or by tradition, it's true in light of nature. And I think that's the kind of pre-modern orientation that Tolkien has.
Right. Okay.
And that's very much part of his Catholic worldview, because Catholicism, you could say, its thinking has been, in some senses, very pre-modern. But you need to take your bearings not by what humankind has made by its own efforts, basically history, but you need to take it in light of sort of the truth in the universe in a way. And that's something that Tolkien and classical political philosophy tend to share in common. In terms of political viewpoints, the understanding politics, I think Tolkien is very much more in line with classical political philosophy than he is modern political philosophy. Obviously, with characters like Saruman, he does not believe in the idea of realpolitik as a real driver of international relations. He just thinks that's fundamentally flawed. But if you look at people like Aragorn and Faramir, they're not people who insist on their rights. They're not democratic, but they are extremely virtuous. They're not ambitious. They're not out for themselves. They basically fulfill the kinds of virtues that classical philosophers often said rulers should fulfill. And that is not a viewpoint that modern political philosophers tend to take. They might analyze modern politics in terms of power or security or, mutual wealth and benefit. They don't think about politics in terms of virtue. And that is where I think
Sure.
Tolkien very sharply disagrees with modern thinking. His political leaders are motivated by virtue. They're very virtuous people, and Aragorn and Faramir are good examples of that. And so that's where I think
Yes.
Tolkien is very close to classical modern political philosophy as opposed to modern political philosophy. And that's something that Strauss hammers a lot within his own writings.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And do you think that some of that backlash, if that's the right word, during recent years as the Game of Thrones shows were coming out, being released, perhaps, at its base relates to a kind of cynicism about that approach to politics? Because one of the criticisms that, for example, Martin gives to Tolkien, which I think is fairly wrong-headed, is, we don't know what Aragorn's tax policy is. And, the implication being that as a ruler, virtue is insufficient. It's this, as you say, this sort of modern idea. And of course, Game of Thrones itself is sort of all about the iniquities of political leaders, in a sense, and the sufferings of the common folk. Do you think that perhaps explains also some of that cynicism from Martin and his readers, some of his readers anyway, who are often quite vociferously opposed to Tolkien as well?
Yeah, and I think the thing with Martin, I think this is true of a lot of the writers whom we consider grimdark writers, Martin, Stephen Erickson, Glenn Cook. They tend to view politics in a very Machiavellian light. The be more evil is basically what Machiavelli advises. Virtue by itself, according to Machiavelli, is useless. You want to have a reputation for virtue, says Machiavelli, but you don't actually want to be virtuous. That is how you fail drastically. And so, and that is, I think, maybe the big difference between people who are following Tolkien and people who really disagree with his worldview. I think Machiavelli is maybe the political theorist who is most deeply ingrained into common sense nowadays. Tolkien was very anti-Machiavellian. He never really mentions them in the writings, but you can tell nothing about the way political relations are used in Lord of the Rings is Machiavellian. Saruman comes closest, and he fails pretty miserably. He doesn't really make a good effort at it. But a lot of fantasists like Glenn Cook or Stephen Erickson or George R.R. Martin, they really do accept that Machiavellian point of view. And one of the interesting things with Tolkien is that he is trying to revive a set of political assumptions where virtue rather than pure power is an important driver of politics. And that's just interesting because it is so counterintuitive nowadays, but it used to be, in pre-modern times, the dominant viewpoint. Classical political philosophy is all about virtue. It doesn't talk about tax codes very much. So this idea that Tolkien is reviving a set of intuitions about political society that has disappeared from common sense today is one of the more radical things that I think is true about him. And that's why I think he's far from being regressive. He's just one of the more interesting writers intellectually there is. But critics don't have the tools to understand what's really radical about Tolkien because they approach his text from a thoroughly modern perspective. That's
really interesting, and I see now where Strauss becomes salient, and as you say, I mean, even in other ways, we've seen sort of, as it were, ancient philosophical modes like Stoicism, perhaps, and to some extent Aristotelianism in its sort of ethical forms. Sort of become popular, and there are sort of self-help books written about Stoicism and how to be a Stoic and things. You've mentioned that this is something that Tolkien is perhaps ought to be sort of, or his work we ought to see his work in that light. Do you think that that's a new and interesting way to read Tolkien, sort of in the context of our modern world, not sort of therapeutically, but there's something enlightening in, I suppose, his approach to politics and perhaps in a more general sense ethics, often derided as a kind of banal tale between, where good and evil are pitched sort of in a in a sort of metaphysical struggle. But do you think there's a depth there that's, perhaps unrealized, I guess? And useful,
certainly. And really, in a sense, the way I approach literary criticism is not so much to see, it's not like Tolkien could be like a self-help. Well, follow these virtues that he says are virtues, and then you're going to be okay. Be like Aragorn and think your life will be hunky-dory. So that's not what I do. But I think he's interesting because the assumptions that are inherent within the social and political orders of Middle-earth are just so thoroughly unusual from a modern perspective that they help us understand what we consider to be assumptions that we don't understand. They help us see our assumptions that we don't realize are assumptions. For example, that Machiavellian point of view, the idea that nations are fearful of other nations and therefore must secure the most power by the most pragmatic means possible. That's very much a part of Martin and Cook and Erickson. And it seems like it's common sense. But Tolkien helps us realize that's a sort of historical viewpoint that wasn't always the case. And so that idea that he can help us question certain assumptions we have is just very interesting. Yeah. Now, there's some things about Tolkien I think he's really wrong about. But even when a writer is wrong, they can help you think about old questions in new ways. And that's what Tolkien does.
So I think we'll leave our discussion of Strauss there. I think you've explained really nicely, how that can sort of perhaps help to enlighten some of Tolkien's sort of perspectives. But just to move on briefly to your other paper, and I know this wasn't a great segue, but quite a different
I thought it was
topic.
very smooth. I didn't even notice a segue.
Indeed. The second paper I sort of wanted to look at is from a different journal, Tolkien Studies, which has sort of become the premier journal. Unfortunately, I think you do need a subscription to have a look at that, but I will give the name of the article. So it's from 2016, or the title, I should say. It's called The Book of the Lost Narrator, Rereading the Silmarillion as a Unified Text. So this article deals with this sort of broad theme, which has become very sort of, I don't want to say de rigueur, but popular in Tolkien studies in the last, I would say, 10 or so years. And a number of scholars have written interesting papers on it. And that is Tolkien as a kind of metafictionist. So Tolkien is, as a writer who is, situating his text in some sort of historical context. And perhaps the well-known example, of course, is The Lord of the Rings is said to be a kind of a redaction or some sort of compilation sort of constructed out of the Red Book of Westmarch, which, in the secondary world, to use his phrase, was sort of a compilation, perhaps diaries and things produced by the hobbits. Many scholars, Verlin Flieger, Michael Drought, Vladimir Berliak, various others have written, as I say, on this. But you've produced a piece which looks at the Silmarillion and sort of tries to argue that, against this idea that, which some scholars have put forward, like I think Gergai Nagy is one of the main proponents of this idea. The Silmarillion is kind of it's a bit of a hodgepodge of disparate sources that have sort of, in this secondary world has been put together. And you've argued sort of, no, we should really see the Silmarillion as a kind of, well, as the title suggests, as a unified text. So I suppose first, do you mind giving some sort of background on the paper and sort of why you felt sort of compelled to write it? I suppose, what was it about that sort of idea that we should sort of radically decenter, I don't know, the sort of the Silmarillion, in some sense. And what then, I suppose, do you think about, how we should read the text of the work as a kind of in a kind of unified perspective?
Okay, yeah. So actually, first, let me mention that if anybody is interested in an article and they don't have access to it, you can just email me. I can send you a copy. So even if it's behind a paywall, just email me. I can get you a copy, and that's not a problem. But yeah, so for that article about the Silmarillion as a unified text, to be honest, I don't have a fancy theoretical argument for that view. It's simply how I've always read the 1977 Silmarillion. And actually, the unified view, that is one coherent text, not a hodgepodge of other things, that unified view is how most people did read the Silmarillion when it first came out. before Christopher Tolkien started publishing the History of Middle-earth. And only then, after the History of Middle-earth, did everybody really get a chance to see just how hard Christopher Tolkien had to work to wrest the Silmarillion into its final form. But as necessarily as the History of Middle-earth has been for Tolkien scholarship, it's not a page-turner if you ever try to go through it. It's interesting in its own right, but it's not going to keep you up into the wee hours of the morning. The Silmarillion itself is not an easy text, but the History of Middle-earth is much less easy. So for better or worse, in my view, the Silmarillion, the 1977 book, that's destined to be the book that most people think about when they think about Tolkien's Legendarium, even if it is a partial collaboration with his son Christopher. So basically, my article on Tolkien Studies is just an attempt to affirm the central status of the Silmarillion by suggesting that its purported flaws, they aren't really flaws. They're just deliberate aspects imposed into that text by a hypothetical narrator. And really, I don't think the argument is that far-fetched, even though it wasn't Tolkien's original intention. Because even if Tolkien never originally intended to present his Legendarium stories as a single, coherent, unified story, those stories were all still written by one person, Tolkien himself. So it's really not that hard to see Tolkien themes appearing over and over again in the 1977 Silmarillion. So in that sense, I think it's kind of intuitive to read it as a unified text because it was written by one guy, Tolkien.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. Do you think? I suppose this gets into how we sort of approach even the Lord of the Rings. But do you think approaching, or as for example, Michael Drought has argued, and I believe will be arguing in greater detail in his upcoming book, that we should really focus or place greater focus on the kind of the metafictional aspects of, for example, the Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion, I guess, to an extent as well. That it is in some sense a constructed text of this secondary world, and that yes, we know that Tolkien wrote the text, but we should actually take the sort of metafictional conceit seriously. We should read the preface and the note on the note on Shire records at the start of the Lord of the Rings, and that we should that should be a sort of important element of our reading, and that therefore we shouldn't take everything in the text kind of as a literal, as we might read a novel, as a kind of literal chronicle of events, for example. That and I think Professor Drought, often talks about the poems, and should we really believe that Sam, recites this poem about the troll or Gil-galad, or should we sort of think about, as a philologist like Tolkien might, should we approach the text as well? Perhaps this poem is a kind of interpolation of a later redactor or something like that, and that if you take that to, I guess, an extreme, it can introduce a kind of radical. I don't know, like radical skepticism about the events that we're reading about, even about the sort of, as we've mentioned before, the natural sort of hierarchy, if you like, that Tolkien seems to hold so close. So, that's I guess, increasingly interesting and commonly, well, at least commonly discussed idea in Tolkien studies. So do you think Michael Drought is right there, or would you sort of want to bring us back from that skeptical precipice?
Well, no, I think he's mostly right. Here and there, his argument as you summarized it. So I think from a practical standpoint, any practicing Tolkienist, you have to have an awareness that the text that we have, the Lord of the Rings, is the mediated access to the reality of the War of the Rings. It's mediated in some way. It's not a perfect mimetic representation of what happened in the War of the Rings. It's too complicated for that because of the purported metafictional aspects of the Lord of the Rings. You can't just ignore it. Although for my purposes, as in relation to Tolkien and the history of political philosophy, it's a little bit orthogonal.
Okay, yeah.
Because I do think, despite the metafictional aspects of Tolkien, we have a pretty good sense of who he was as a person and as a writer and his various viewpoints, despite those metafictional aspects to him. And that's why one of your other questions I saw is you're sort of, how do we relate him to someone like Borges? And I don't think Tolkien
Yes,
relates
yeah.
very much to typical postmodern writers at all. The way I see it is like I said, I have seen arguments that try to categorize Tolkien as postmodern in some sense. My sense is that they seem to want to praise Tolkien by linking him with a discourse that's currently prestigious within literary studies,
Yes, yeah.
but one that does not very well describe Tolkien's various viewpoints. So things like the appendices, the maps, and the prologue, even things like his unpublished book of Marzible,
Yes,
from the Mines of Moria, I do tend to see them as a way of reinforcing the believability of his fiction by cloaking it within a modern scholarly apparatus. And this is something that he would have been very familiar with as a philologist who's studying, medieval cultures. You don't have direct access to the past. You can only sort of make educated guesses about it based on what has survived, the surviving historical record. And so in that sense, he understands that there's problems.
For sure.
But what he does not do, I don't think, is I don't see Tolkien as seeing our problematic access to the past as emphasizing that reality is a social construction, or that historical narrative can only resemble fiction rather than history itself. And that is what I see metafictionists like Borges or Tim O'Brien doing. Although metafiction doesn't entirely equate to postmodernism, I don't see Tolkien as postmodern because I think in the end, he believes in history. Maybe our access to that true history is problematic or complicated, and maybe it's never going to be perfect. But that's more of a problem of transmitting historical knowledge to current times than it is a full-scale assault on what historical knowledge even means. And I do think a lot of those postmodern metafictionists are trying to question the very idea of historical truth. I think Tolkien was pretty much okay with that, the idea of historical truth.
Yeah, I agree, and I think as an archaeologist, I tend to side more with Tolkien. I mean, I need to anyway because I need to believe that there was some sort of past. Although I guess there's some archaeologists who are sort of radical in that sense, but yeah, I think that's just to return to the Silmarillion for a moment. Obviously the Silmarillion is notoriously difficult, at least in the popular imagination. And of course, it begins with this creation story. And you mentioned, Tolkien believes in history. But when we come to a text like the Silmarillion in the creation story, and we're thinking about Tolkien as a metafictionist, and I know at least in its published form, the Silmarillion, doesn't have that critical apparatus, at least as a kind of paratext quite so much. But sort of in my reading, at least, of the Silmarillion, it's fairly clear that this is kind of a text in the secondary world, that itself is a kind of mythology in the context of the secondary world, and that we shouldn't sort of necessarily take, for example, the Ainulindale, the creation story, as a kind of literal, record of events. But when we come to those kinds of documents, and what do you think? And, I understand perhaps for a lot of readers, perhaps that's a kind of a radical view because, a lot of people will read the Silmarillion as a kind of key, to Tolkien's theology and, all sorts of other questions that the Lord of the Rings raises. And they'll simply point to some aspect in the Silmarillion and say, well, this is what it says. Therefore, here's our answer. Do you think if we approach the Silmarillion as a kind of, from this metafictional point of view, we can sort of question some of the, as you say, the kind of historical elements of it, given that the kind of genre that we're looking at, and for example, the Ainulindale, is clearly mythological. Yes.
So even within the story world, you think that we should sort of see the Ainulindale as being fictionalized in a sense within the story world itself.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's just how I read it because it reads to me so obviously as a kind of, in a genre sense, as a kind of mythological text, analogous to Genesis in an obvious way. And perhaps I'm only saying this because, I myself read, for example, biblical texts in that way, and I'm not myself religious, which perhaps is just a result of my perspective. Then, do you think that's going too far in that sense, or?
Actually, that's an interesting question because there is a tradition of biblical literalism of reading everything in the Bible as a literal record of the way things are, but usually from like American evangelicals and some Protestant sects. I'm not really sure of the Catholic standpoint on it, but I think they're a little bit more open to a sort of metaphorical or more spiritual interpretation of things like the Book of Genesis. And so even
Sure.
though we don't quite know if what books like Genesis or the Anu Dali, we don't even know if they're literally true, but in a sense they're spiritually or metaphorically true. They're a story that forms the meditation for modern faith in that sense. And so necessarily, I don't think the question of the literal truth of the mythological stories within Arda is not necessarily the most important question to ask, but how those stories tend to be used by the characters within Middle Earth. And I think for the most part, I mean, the elves, the men of Gondor, the men of Rohan, they tend to assume the truth of those stories, or at least they act under the assumption that those stories are true. And that's just part of growing up within a certain tradition of thought. So in that sense, the literal truth of the creation story and the Silmarillion within the story world itself, that's kind of an open question, but I don't think you necessarily have to believe in it literally within the story world for it to have a very concrete effect on how the characters in Middle-earth understand the world.
So I think at this stage we can bring the conversation to a close. Was there anything else, I guess, you wanted to, or you would like to say, regarding the, Tolkien as a metafictionist, this topic? I think you've sort of summarized your view in that paper. But yeah, was there anything, I guess, you wanted to mention, or?
No, it's just the whole field of Tolkien studies right now is really robust. It's really moving along. And so it's really interesting to talk about these issues of where the field is going and what kind of changes there are. Sure. You mentioned the idea of the idea of diverse Tolkien has been gaining some steam in some circles. And I think that that's a really promising new trend for the field. Although I do have some skeptical about some of the theoretical presuppositions that are that drive those particular readings, but the basic goals themselves, I think, are very laudable. And so understanding where the Tolkien field of Tolkien studies are going to go in the next 10 years, it's just a really fascinating topic because there's so much research being done on Tolkien. So many different people from multiple countries, multiple continents are doing work on Tolkien. And so we really have a chance to see a lot of different perspectives on a single writer. That we really don't get to see for any other writer I know about. I don't think who inspires so much criticism as Tolkien does across so many different languages and continents and countries. There's a Chinese Tolkien society, for crying out loud. I mean, he's everywhere. You don't see that for T.S. Eliot, necessarily, or David Joyce even.
Yeah, and just anecdotally, it seems like in Brazil and other places in South America, it seems to be very popular as well. Yeah, well, I guess, just as a final question before I let you go, in the last few episodes of the podcast, we have talked a little bit about the Amazon show, and just very briefly, I guess, what are your thoughts on the Amazon show? And look, we don't know much about it, but it will be set, as I've said, in the Second Age, and probably, we'll be going to Numenor and the Forging of the Rings. And do you have any interest in that, first of all? Is sort of adaptations interesting to you, or
Honestly, I have not been following the news whatsoever. I'm keeping my hopes absurdly low, so they won't be disappointed. And so whatever they produce will exceed my extremely low hopes. So I will be pleasantly surprised. I hope it's good. I was not a fan of the Peter Jackson films. I thought he was a little too. He had too many filmmaking cliches in his presentation. But I really like some of the things that Amazon has done. So, we'll see. We'll see how it comes.
No, I think that's a very reasonable position at this stage. And as I've said, we know almost nothing about it apart from the setting. So they're being very, very coy at the moment. But yeah, we'll see. Well, look, thank you for coming on. I think that was a fascinating discussion, and I certainly learned a lot about Strauss, and I'll be looking for. I know in that paper, you do mention a few a few tentative, perhaps neo-Straussian readings that if readers want to, or if listeners, I should say, want to go and read that paper, you can also look up. But hopefully, we'll see perhaps more of that. Are you sort of thinking about writing more in that space, perhaps? Looking at Strauss.
I am working on my monograph right now, which is called Spectres of Tolkien.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I shall definitely.
I'm currently working on that at the moment.
That's awesome. I shall definitely get that when it comes out. Very good. And where can people sort of find you if they're interested in having a look at some of these papers that we've talked about? And as I said, there are quite a few others as well, and not only on Tolkien, but various other literature related topics.
Well, my website is denniswilsonwise.net. So that's my academic website. You can look up my CV, anything else. If you see anything that captures your interest, my email is on my website as well, and you can just contact me at any point. You can Google me. I'm on my University of Arizona Department faculty page, so I show up that way on Google. But yeah, you can just Google me. Like I said, my website is denniswilsonwise.net. But
awesome, fantastic.
I'm pretty open to email, so it doesn't matter to me.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you, Dennis, for coming on. I think, as I said, I learned a lot. So that was a great discussion. So all the best, and I will eagerly await your monograph.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. It was a real pleasure chatting with you today from half a world away.
Indeed, yes. All right. Well, we'll have a good evening, and we'll watch your career with great interest, as Senator Palpatine would say.
All right. Thank you so much.
Right. Bye.